Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of today's Passivhaus workshop. I hope you've enjoyed the day, those that have been with us since 10 o'clock this morning, and particularly those that have been with us since 10 o'clock yesterday morning, actually. So this is the 12th and final session. I've been really pleased with how the session's gone. I probably shouldn't say this out loud with one session to go, but at the moment, I don't think we've had too many technical glitches and things seem to have gone quite well. So I'm just going to touch some wood and hope that continues just for the next hour. So this was a really engaging session yesterday. This is your chance to ask your questions to the panel, and the panel is made up of all of the presenters that have spoken during today. So it's going to be hosted by Chris, who's on the screen there. So Chris, if you joined his introductory session either today or yesterday morning, he's the chair of the Passivhaus Trust. We're really pleased to have been able to produce this workshop as we normally would do if we were, if our doors were open in the centre in partnership with the Passivhaus Trust. And all the presenters and panellists that will be with us now are all members of the Passivhaus Trust. So we're very pleased to work with them. We have had over the 2 days 267 different attendees to the workshop. So we're really pleased with the level of take up, and I hope that you found it useful and informative. So yes, so like always, whenever we do a question time session in the centre, what happens is you get 1 or 2 hands up at the beginning, and then when there's about 5 minutes left of the session, there's about 20 hands up. So I'll encourage you to ask your questions earlier, and we will do our best to answer them. This session, like all of the others, is being recorded. We will send you a link to all the recordings from the sessions over the 2 days. Realistically, we need to upload them, edit them, and then put them somewhere safe for you to then find. So I think I'll probably send you all an email with these links realistically Wednesday or Thursday this coming week, so probably the second half of this coming week, but certainly by next weekend we'll have links to all of the recordings so you can re-watch any session. So if I can ask all the panelists to share their videos and reveal themselves now, we'll get started with the question time. Chris, I'll just hand over to you quickly. Did you want to have any introductory words before we begin?
No, I know yesterday's session was very interesting, and we got lots of good feedback. So I'm hoping it'll be the same today. I'm sure it will. We've got I see 80 people involved today. So I hope we can answer lots of your questions. We've got key experts, and probably most of them will be familiar to you already because you'll have seen their presentations. But in a moment, I will ask them to introduce themselves. I'm just warning them now, a moment before, just to sort of give them a very quick summary about themselves. Yeah, and then I look forward to an interesting hour, really.
Yeah, great, excellent. Okay, so what we would normally do is just go around and just ask the panelists. I know probably most people in this session have met them, so just very briefly, just to introduce themselves and remind us who they are and what they do.
Well, I'm going to do that, and I'm also going to ask you, which I didn't actually do yesterday, if you've got a top tip that you've learned that you think is the most important tip that you have to give people again and again. What is if you've got a top tip, if you haven't got anything that stands out, don't worry, I'm not putting you on the spot, but if you can think of something, that would be great. So brief introduction, very brief, and top tip for people, your top tip for Passivhaus. I'll start, just because the order you're on my screen at the moment, I'll start with Alan.
Hi everyone, Alan Budden, eco-design consultant, architect and Passivhaus designer. I've been doing Passivhaus now for about 9-10 years, both new build and retrofit. My top tip would be to look at the form factor. That's the ratio between usable floor space and heat loss area. So the more compact your house is, or your building is, the less heat loss you've got. The easier it will be to get to Passivhaus because you'll need less insulation. The easier it will be to make airtight because there's less corners and junctions, and the cheaper it will be. So it's really a win-win. And yeah, that's my top tip.
Great, thank you, Alan. And Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Anna Cutt. I'm a architectural technician, and also I work for Passivhaus Homes. We provide a system that enables people to build to the Passivhaus standard using timber and wood-based insulations. My top tip after form factor, because that is the top tip. Stolen already, Alan. Second one is to model early. Use PHPP to get your building modelled early in the process before planning, if possible, because after planning you may be locked into some decisions that might have cost implications and energy implications that could be difficult to get out of.
Great, thank you, Anna. And I'll move on to Paul. And Paul and I are colleagues anyway at Green Building Store. So hi, Paul. So yeah, introduction and top tip.
Hiya, I'm Paul Smith from the Green Building Store, Senior Construction Technician and Certified Passivhaus Consultant. Top tip is, in the UK climate, always have a supplementary heating system. So don't rely on heating through the ventilation system. It's just not suitable in the UK climate. Yeah, that's my top tip. Treat the MVHR as ventilation and not a heating system, and look at for your heating as a secondary.
Right, thank you, Paul. And we'll move on to Clarissa, who may even want to comment on that at some point, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities. So introduction and top tip, Clarissa.
Hello, I'm Associate Director at Total Home Environment. We put sustainable technology into new builds. So this includes heat recovery ventilation, heat pump ventilation, air source heat pumps, central vacuum systems, everything to make it nice, sustainable and healthy. We also do heat loss calcs, SAP Appendix Q reports and MCS certification. My top tip, I've been through a new build and a renovation, and there's quite a few. I would probably say you've got to get everybody on side to what you're thinking. So if you want to go down this passive house route, you're going to have to make sure everybody knows that they have got to be have attention to detail. Have an air tightness champion on side. Make sure your project manager is there and understands that you want what's on paper happening in practice. And this also sort of coincides with not getting too buddy-buddy with the people on site. At the end of the day, you're paying them and you want them to build what you want to build, not what they think you want to build or what they feel like doing on the day.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So that's like hard gained advice, I think. See it. Okay, let's start with a question.
Okay, great. So Keith has asked, will timber frame be the only way to build a house to comply with embedded CO2 in the future? And I guess another spin on that is a question that we had yesterday, which has come up a couple of times already, in terms of what's the best building system to achieve passive house standard?
Okay, right. Well, I won't comment on that because I think you can answer this the way you want, both elements of that, and I'll ask Anna first, based on your presentation today.
So I think it's certainly, assuming you choose the timber from the right source, it's certainly easier to achieve the RIBA 2030 climate challenge targets using timber. It becomes harder as you use systems that have high embodied carbon in them. What I sort of didn't say in my presentation, and I guess I have the opportunity to say now, is that obviously there's parts of the embodied carbon in materials is attributed to just what they're made of, and you're not going to get away with that from that. And then other parts will be how they're made and how the power plants are run. So we might see as manufacturing is powered by more renewable technologies, we might see some materials, the embodied carbon associated with some materials go down, and then others are just inherently high carbon, and I think that it would be difficult to make them as low carbon as timber.
Thank you. So it's a sort of maybe.
Yeah, it's partly maybe because again it comes back to things like Alan was saying about form factor and cost and energy. It's also form factor, cost, energy, and embodied carbon. You have a complicated envelope with lots of surface area. using more materials. You have a bigger house, using more materials. So yeah, you know, a compact building. I think I showed an example that had a combination of timber and oil-based installations that was passing. And then you might have you know, if you wanted a brick skin, for example, you could you use reclaimed brick, so you don't have the cost of the firing of new brick using brick that's come off the house that's been demolished.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I'll come to you, Alan, because I know you've built in various ways and thought about this quite a lot as well.
Yeah. Well, to start with, I think it's possible to build in all systems to get to Passivhaus, from masonry to timber frame. But that's part of the question. But I agree with everything Anna said there. I think one of the things you might want to look at is just reducing the amount of material. So making sure if you are using timber, don't use too much. Just use what you need to use. The other material that springs to mind is some of the recycled stuff, like warm cell. So recycled newspaper as an insulation is great, because that's, again, this is kind of tree based originally. And maybe also look at straw. I mean, straw bale, the cocoon system, which I think I showed in my tour, is very good in terms of the embodied carbon, again with timber. So that's really, I think, all I'd add to it. Really. Thank you.
Looked at porotherm blocks. Have you ever used something like that? The unfired clay blocks, which are quite low carbon.
We have. They're imported, unfortunately, so they do have some travel associated with it. So yeah, there are other options like that, and I think things will get developed as the embodied carbon becomes a more of a important thing to think about. I know it's fairly new on the radar of a lot of designers, but it is getting more and more important as the grid gets greener.
Okay, Paul, you've given some thought as well, haven't you?
Yeah, just one thought on timber is the full life cycle of it, so cradle to end of life. And as far as I'm aware at the minute, once timber reaches its end of life, it goes to incinerator. The recycling processes aren't there yet to reuse it. So in that respect, it's then releasing its carbon just as much as anything else. Also, materials like steel that get a bad rap. I mean, reduce as much steel as possible within the dwelling, but that is a material that can be fully recycled and reused at the end of its life. So it's just that everyone needs to look at the full picture and not just focus and hone in on one aspect of it and think that's the full story and the final thing. It's conscientious design and reducing the overall impact of the materials we choose to use to build this, not focusing on a material to build everything from.
Thank you, Paul. And last, Clarissa, did you take these issues into account on your own projects?
Yes, I'm a very green person myself, and I try and do everything I possibly can. So, I mean, my renovation, you know, my husband was quite keen on knocking it down and putting something better in a better position on our land. But it was Cotswold stone, and I thought it was beautiful and very chocolate boxy. So I said, no, let's keep it there. So, you know, we had to really go for it with the renovation. I mean, it looked like a barn at one stage, and we had awful damp problems. So we had to dig down. So we did have to have new floors, but we've gone over the top with insulation to ensure that for the most part, living in it forever, we will use as least amount of energy as possible. And, you know, when you see these houses lasting for hundreds of, well, not hundreds of centuries, but hundreds of years, you know, it's worth investigating all the different types of materials out there and spending as much focus as you can on the fabric of the building.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. Sorry, Harvey, I know you said we keep this nice and crisp. Okay, it's a very interesting topic. So
a question from Jocelyn, who I seem to recall was here with us yesterday as well. Hello, Jocelyn. So Jocelyn's heard from several presenters that with Passivhaus, you're unlikely to need supplementary heating, or if you install it, you may not ever use it. We saw that with Ben Adam Smith in his case study yesterday. Jocelyn is saying that she's getting slightly older. So should she, thinking about future-proofing and living in the home for the long run, should she be thinking about installing supplementary heating for when she's less mobile? And if so, what would the panel recommend?
Okay, I'll ask Clarissa to head off on this one, if you can.
Yeah. If you're designing your property correctly, if whoever's designing it is doing their job, then there shouldn't be any need to do anything further just because you might be less mobile in a few years' time. It should be comfortable. It should be a comfortable environment for anybody, whether you're going to be sitting down a lot or whether you're going to be moving around a lot. I mean, that's the beauty of a passive house. It should be lovely, temperate environment all the time. You know, if you were going down getting the renewable heat incentive to get your MCS certificate, you would have to have a heating system, whether or not it was an air source heat pump or whether it was a heat pump ventilation system, Paul, that would do the job. Otherwise, you simply wouldn't get past building regs as well. So you shouldn't have to worry about that because it should be done come rain or shine.
And I'll just ask Paul to comment as you headed on this sort of topic at the beginning.
You know my opinion on it from the start. For the time being, people need to catch up with the ventilation aspect of it first. It's just the way that people are looking at it. I know that it all stems from Passive House saying that a true Passive House can be heated from the MVHR system without the additional requirement for a supplementary heating system. But the issue is it's slow response. It's oh well, there's lots of issues.
Can I just jump in there and say the heat recovery ventilation doesn't provide heating.
Yeah.
Heat recovery ventilation recovers heat that's already in the house, be it from appliances, be it from cooking, bathing. So whether you're talking about heat recovery ventilation, all that is doing is reusing the heat rather than chucking it outside, which, you know, trickle vents, extractor fans, passive stack, etc. that's what's happening. Heat pump ventilation, because it's got a heat pump inside it, that is the one that's actually adding a bit more heat to the system to allow you to have some space heating. We're not saying that it's the be all and end all for everybody. It's only for houses that are very well insulated and very airtight. And, you know, quite a lot of the time, houses shape-wise won't be suitable because they're just too big or the air volumes aren't correct, and you will need some sort of formal heating system, whether it be air source heat pumps or radiant heating, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, Paul.
No, it's fine. Everything says correct. The PHPP itself actually within it tells you whether your house is suitable for heating from the ventilation system, because a lot of people have this perception that if any passive house that they build, it's suitable, but it's not. It's only to certain aspects. The PHI allocate a certain amount of floor area per person and base the calculations on it. And what you have is two people in a 500 square metre house thinking because it meets passive house criteria, they can heat it from the ventilation system. So it's just trying to debunk this myth that it's suitable.
I think we'll probably move on. I know Alan and Anna could happily comment on this. All I would add perhaps is that one of the myths is that passive house doesn't need heating, and of course it does. It's going to need 15 kilowatt hours per metre squared per annum, 10 watts per metre squared, so a very small amount of heat. And there are really your passive house designer or consultant will be looking at this to see what the best solution, along with your solutions provider, somebody like Clarissa. So take advice, but it's not going to be a big part of the issue. I think it's probably covered things enough for now, and we should get the next question.
Okay, great. So this is a question from Alan. So Alan's asking, aside from the financial benefits of cost savings in the long term, are there any proven planning or resale benefits to being Passive House certified, particularly in a new build?
Okay, I'll ask Alan to come in on that first.
Okay, good name, Alan.
It wasn't you.
It wasn't me, no. Yes, I think there is some evidence to show that it is improving values. If you have two houses side by side, the passive house will have a slightly higher value. At least people are saying it will. Whether in reality is a slightly different question. It can help with planning. It's only a help. It won't necessarily guarantee planning by any means. It's just a slight extra lever. I think one of the good things at the moment is when doing your passive house training course, you do some on the cost benefits of a passive house and the accountancy. And it's always a question between fuel price and the cost of borrowing money. And at the moment, with cost of borrowing money going down to sort of nothing, it's a very good time to go to passive house because the payback periods are much shorter. So I think you'll get your benefits in other forms, not just the resale value. It will be in health. It will be in the value of reduced fuel bills. It will be just being happy, I think, is the biggest benefit.
So I think we've probably covered probably sufficient time.
Question. So this is good news for you all. So this is from Marie. So Marie is self-building for the first time. And she said they had been envisaging going down the standard timber frame route, but now after this weekend, they want to build passive house. So that's got to be some success already.
Yes.
So what degree of involvement do clients, individuals normally have? So I think Marie was initially considering project managing the build, but after everything she's learned this weekend, she's wondering whether that would be a bit foolish with passive house. So what level of involvement should Marie be having with her project?
Right. Anna, would you like to comment on that? I think.
Yeah. So it's like, well, it depends really, which I know isn't a very helpful answer. But so I obviously work for a company that provides a system that tries to make it very easy for people to build to the passive house standard, because we've worked out all of the, or we work out all of the junctions, which is where passive house becomes difficult, or the air tightness junctions and the thermal junctions. So if you go with a system, and there are other systems available, then that could help try and take some of the strain out. And we've had some clients who have not just project managed it, but even built it with their own hands. And then we've had other clients who don't really want to get involved in that way, and they've gone down the sort of more traditional route of having an architect who's overseeing it or overseeing the contract, and then us working with the contractor. Passive house shouldn't, it doesn't need to be complicated. I think it becomes complicated when you try and come up with things that are new for each, or very bespoke for each project. So I think it slightly depends on what your vision is and what your design is. And I think if you speak to some passive house designers, they will be able to probably advise you whether they think that a system is suitable or whether you need something more bespoke, and also whether this is something you could manage yourself.
And would that be your experience as well, Alan?
Yes, it is. I think we've had varying clients who've got more or less involved with different things, depending a little bit on your system you're building. If it's a refurb, we've definitely had a lot of clients who have got very involved with the air tightness and have done a lot of the taping themselves. And again, on the new builds, they may be the case, but then again, some of the suppliers will be doing all the air tightness for you. But otherwise, you could definitely take on that sort of role. It's a role that we've found that a lot of the construction industry at the moment isn't up to speed on. So your general builder isn't necessarily great at doing air tightness. They may also not be the best. I mean, they may have, from working outside, not the daintiest of hands to fold tape. So again, it's definitely something that the clients we find can take on. They can spend that little bit extra time and effort on it as well, because the time's not such an issue for them necessarily. So they can make sure it's really good, and obviously they're going to get the benefit from it. So we've definitely found that as something that the client can take on and champion, and make sure that whenever people come onto site, and new team members, that they're all aware of sort of the air tightness layers and can really champion that side of things. But yeah, being involved all the way through is always good, to really understand the building and how it works. So we like to help educate the clients as we go through the system.
So no simple answer really, but basically depending on the build type, the build system, but generally client involvement is a good thing, I think. So certainly look at that and think about how involved you want to be. I think I would take out of that.
Okay.
Harvey?
Yeah, Joe's asking, can you build a passive house extension on an existing building? Would that give them a warm, comfortable, clean air study, or is it just not worth it?
Well, I will come straight back to Alan just because I know he's done this.
Yeah.
And then
Yes, you can.
Right, and next.
No, I think it's the analogy of the sieve or the colander. If you can make close off half the holes, then you'll lose less water. So having a good passive house extension will definitely help. It doesn't mean that the rest of the house is suddenly going to be perfect. It will still be leaky, but overall, you'll find that probably the rest of the house gets slightly better. We've done that on a project just outside Cambridge, and the client there who lived in it was surprised how much warmer the rest of the house suddenly became because they'd had this really good extension on it, even though they hadn't done any work on that yet. But I think the important thing to me would be to make sure that you've done the calculations for the whole house and you've got a plan for the whole house. So once you've done your extension, maybe in 5-10 years time, you can then go back and do the rest of the house, and you've kind of worked out what you're going to do at all the junctions, so you can try and minimize any wastage and any having to redo things. So you kind of, and you've got to the right levels you need to be. So if it was an extra 10 millimeters of insulation on the walls, then you just do that now, because you know eventually you can get to the Passive House retrofit standard. That's going to be my recommendation.
Would you, Alan, would you tend to recommend thermally separating the extension? So putting insulation unit in the main house and maybe putting an external door? So do not do that.
No, I wouldn't necessarily do that. If you're going to be heating both sides, then it doesn't matter. If you're, I suppose I'll take that back. If you were going to do an extension and the rest of the house was, I don't know, really, really cold, and you weren't going to heat it as much, and you're going to live in most of the extension, then I would. But if you were going to be living in both spaces equally, then I wouldn't worry about it too much and just think about it. But obviously, thinking about the ventilation is another tricky one, because you might not want to put the MVHR in on day one with a small extension. Yeah. And then you have to go down the road of putting trickle vents in, which again isn't really what you want. So ideally, you try and bring in the MVHR possibly earlier than would necessarily be fully advantageous in terms of the performance, because you might not have a very good air tightness because of the rest of the house. But it's probably worth thinking about early, because it does give you that ventilation, the filtered air and all the other lovely things. So I probably would put it in early, even if it's not saving energy.
And just picking that up, Clarissa, would you be saying the same thing, really?
Yes, I mean, there's been research, which I think Passive House Trust has done recently, showing that even if you have got a slightly leaky house, there's so many benefits to the ventilation. It is more controllable than trickle vents and extractor fans, etc. And you do get rid of all those VOCs a lot more, and it's more, you're recovering all that heat you would normally just lose all the time. And reusing it and getting rid of the mold spores. And even in one of the old houses I used to live in, we retrofitted it in, and the difference it made just to condensation. We used to have horrible mold around the windows in the bathrooms and things like that. Just the difference it made to be, you know, gently extracting air all the time and then putting nice fresh air back in. It got rid of all that, you know. And I have asthma, my children has asthma, and it really does make a difference just to air quality.
Chris, just whilst we're on this topic of retrofit, David has asked a similar question, and I think it touches on something that Anna was talking about this morning. So David's saying that, bearing in mind that the vast majority of the current housing stock is still going to be here in 20, 30 years' time, how important do you think retrofit is in terms of dealing with the climate emergency that we're facing? And should there be government incentives to encourage better retrofitting of existing homes?
Right, we'll keep the comments fairly brief, otherwise this will cover the rest of the half hour. And since you were mentioned in context, do you want to make the first comment on that, Hannah?
Yeah, so I think last time someone gave me the rate of retrofits we need to be doing to hit the 2050 target. It was sort of over 2,000 a day or something like that.
It's some phenomenal figure, yeah.
It's, I mean, it's a phenomenal figure, and so retrofit is definitely part of the solution. There is a number of buildings that are going to be very difficult to retrofit. My personal view, I used to work for an architect's practice that focused on retrofit, and my personal view is that why are we being charged 5% VAT for retrofit and 0% VAT for new build?
My sentiments entirely.
It seems like an immediate prohibitive economic measure. There are projects out there where people are looking to demolish their buildings because it ends up being cheaper than to retrofit them. And that just seems like madness to me. So that my question would be what the VAT. So yes, incentives are needed.
Thank you, Anna. And Paul, what's you've worked quite a lot in retrofit, so I know you've thought about this a lot. You're thinking about
Keeping it brief, yes, it's very important, and yes, there should be incentives. And will we get them? Maybe, probably not, but keeping it brief.
Okay, well, I've got another question that I think probably is directly aimed at you, Paul. It's a quick, probably a quick win question. So it's from Rob. Just think about windows. Passivhaus, does he need certified Passivhaus windows, or can triple glazed be enough?
They don't need to be certified, but you need the evidence that they meet the certification criteria. So yeah, you can get a certified window. All that a certified window is, it means it's in the Passivhaus database, and the information can be easily accessed. If you use a window from a manufacturer, just make sure that they have all the correct information that they can give you, that you then need to give to the certifier to get your project certified.
I think we probably ought to add to that, Paul, shouldn't we, that in the warmer, we are part of the cool temperate zone in terms of certification. And in fact, that includes central Germany, which is a lot better than we are. So build a Passivhaus, meet all the criteria while using a window that's slightly lower performance than a certified Passivhaus window would be, but it would need to be triple glazed, I think. Yeah. Okay, I think that's probably answered that one fairly well.
Okay, great. Right, this is from Anonymous, but it's a good question. So thanks to all the presenters for 2 days of excellent sessions. Thank you. Now that we've evolved beyond just a fuse board and a mains water valve, are there any recommended minimum dimensions for a plant room to house the new services, such as a hot water buffer tank, heat pumps, MBHR, etc.?
Don't think I've ever had that one asked. So, Larissa, you want to have a go at that?
Yes. Well, from my own house, we managed to scrape out quite a large utility room that's got all our kit in it. Electricity meters, central vacuums, tanks, all that sort of thing. And I think that is about 3 meters by about 3 meters. I know that the Potton house over at St Neots is slightly smaller than that, and it's still copable. But it is tricky to service items, so I'd just be aware of the fact that if you want your plumbers, electricians, etc., to be able to service your items, to think about the space around the equipment as well. So I would say that the Potton one would be a bit small, about 2 by 1 meter. But I think you'd need, definitely 3 by 2 or something along those lines, and then you've got good access as well. Of course, you can always do what Build It did with their education house over at Graven Hill and combine the two, a bit like how we've done. And you've still got lots of kitchen units in this sort of utility area. You've still got all your gubbins, but it's definitely a behind or a downstairs room rather than for guests to see. But it means that you can still utilise the area to do your ironing and hang washing out and stuff, but you've still got all your gubbins in there.
Anybody else like to add anything? Or do you think that? Okay, yeah. I think obviously it would depend a bit on how much plant there is. I mean, depends exactly what you choose in terms of plant, of course, won't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got ground source heat pump, you're going to have quite a bit of equipment in addition, inside the house as well as outside the house. So obviously, depending on what type of systems you end up going for, if you've got photovoltaic, obviously you might consider having a battery for electricity storage. Underfloor heating, obviously you're going to have lots of pipes and buffer tanks and things like that. So figuring out what is going to be best for you and your house will then tell you exactly how much space you need, really.
The only thing I think,
sorry, Aaron.
okay, I was only going to add that I think you need a hot water tank. I think going forward, a hot water tank is going to be quite useful again in the building, in terms of being able to take your energy at different times of day, where depending on the cost of that energy and the availability of your resource in terms of PV or other things. So a hot water tank needs to be space needs to be allowed for again, where you won't have necessarily a combi gas boiler that can just produce instant hot water. Those sort of things are going to be things of the past.
I was going to use an example of a project that I worked on in a previous job. I think we might see the return of a sort of double airing cupboard, but perhaps a bit deeper to fit the hot water cylinder and a buffer tank if you're looking for an air source heat pump. And then you're looking for another single but deep airing cupboard type size thing for your MVHR. That sort of level of storage is probably necessary.
It is fair to say you may not put everything in one place either.
No, you might not.
With the Denbigh Ale house, we put the MVHR unit out in the garage, in fact. So we had a tiny plant room. It only had a cylinder and a gas boiler at the time. So it is very much, horses for courses and looking at what you need, really. Okay, should we take another question, Harvey?
Yeah, so a completely different subject now. So this is from Mark. So Mark runs an architectural practice, and he's asking, you'd be interested to know from any architects on the panel, how do you deal with the fee costs when doing the additional work of designing a passive house? And he's suggesting that everyone listening, in terms of being potential clients, would be interested to know how that fee structure works as well.
Okay, well, I'll start with Alan on this one.
Yeah. Okay. No, we separate it out. So we have a fee proposal, and we usually break down all the different services. So we'd have the architectural ones, then we'd have the PHPP calculations, and we'd have other add-ons and stuff within that. We also offer PHPP and environmental consultancy to other architectural practices. So Mark, we may be able to help you, and we do that for a number of practices, as well as doing our own projects. So we would have the PHPP and our option support, where we do the full analysis, and then we'd also then be able to help on an hourly basis in terms of going through construction drawings and helping with detailing in terms of air tightness, thermal bridging, and all those sort of things. And then onwards potentially with the certification and collection of information and stuff like that. So yeah, separate it out is my thing. Don't try and just put it all in, because you'll spend lots more time on this and be really broke.
I can see you nodding, Anna.
Yeah, so we used to, so when I used to work for Architects Press, we used to schedule it out in our scheduled services. Obviously, there is a bit of a crossover when it comes to stage 4 technical design. You're going to be doing your construction detail package. So I suppose there's a bit of a crossover there. But in terms of the PHPP and the constant reviewing of PHPP and now extending perhaps further into pH ribbon and things like that, I think definitely schedule it out.
Do you want to just explain what pH ribbon is?
So pH ribbon is a great sort of plugin for PHPP developed by Tim Martell, and it allows you to use the information that you've already put in your PHPP. You've already scheduled out your materials, your building materials in your U-value sheets, and you will have scheduled out the areas of your building in your area sheets, and it enables you to apply kilograms of carbon dioxide per meter squared for those materials, and then that will give you an embodied carbon calculation for your building. And then you can add extra things on that PHPP doesn't look at, like finishes, etc., if you want to. So it's very useful for passive house design, because it's not that complicated, and it kind of doesn't mean you're doubling up on work, because it uses some of the information that you've already put in there.
I suppose the only thing we might add is that where you have you employ an architect you trust, but they don't have the Passivhaus experience and they're working alongside a consultant, then obviously those fees might be put in as a separate package from the consultant, mightn't they, as well, I guess. Okay, Harvey.
Okay, great. So I'm just checking our website. Right. Okay. So we've had more questions today than yesterday regarding existing properties, which is quite interesting. So there's a number of people asking it in slightly different ways, but asking really just if the panel can expand slightly on the NFIT standard. So Anthony, for example, is saying he can imagine the demolition and rebuild is always preferable, but if you're restricted by planning, is NFIT a realistic option in terms of? So yeah, it's kind of a slight expansion on what the NFIT standard is, and is it a realistic option for some people?
And can we perhaps pick up the issue of demolition and rebuild, because obviously the energy costs there, if it's rolled out across the country, are enormous. So would you like to figure that, Paul?
NFIT, expanding on NFIT. So for the NFIT standard, there's two ways achieving it. So you can either achieve it by the 25 kilowatt hour per metre square per annum space heat demand. Failing that, you can achieve it by a component method. So what the Passivhaus Institute has recognised is that with regard to some buildings, whatever you do to them, they will not get down to that 25 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, whether that be due to orientation, form, window openings. If you're restricted to internal insulation, because you can't do external insulation and things like that. So what they've done is relax the criteria in certain instances. So if you are restricted to internal insulation, instead of having to achieve a 0.15 U value on your walls, you aim to achieve a 0.35 U value on your walls. And they'll also put certain caveats in there. So if you can prove to them that a certain element has to remain in a certain way, then they'll accept it, and at the end of it you can still get the standard. The way they're approaching it is, as long as you still meet the comfort and hygiene criterion, you're allowed to have a slightly less fabric efficiency in terms of energy.
Thank you, Paul. One of the interesting issues here is how much we do go to Passivhaus in terms of our retrofit, particularly as you roll out across the country, and also the role of demolition and rebuilding against retrofitting, isn't it? Alan's burning to get in there, so let's go next, Alan.
Yeah, to be honest, I want to pick up a point from the earlier one that Anna raised about VAT. I think it's slightly worse than the 5%, because most of it would actually be 20%. I think things like the MVHR, you can't get 5% discount unless that's 20%. And worse still, I've heard rumours that VAT may be rising in years to come to pay back for some of the costs more recently of coronavirus. So I think the VAT question is a real big one. There is a couple of ways out of it which are kind of ridiculous. If you have a house that's empty for 2 years, you can actually reduce your VAT down to 5%. So it almost encourages you to not live in your house, which is madness. But there are some things to get around it. But we need to campaign against that. We need to remove VAT. It's the only way forward, really. And think about the Eurofit, which is sort of the add-on to NFIT, which is the NFIT by stages. So work out what you need to do to your house to get to NFIT, then go back and certify it in stages. So even if you move on, the next person who buys the house has got that plan of action and can eventually get to NFIT, and do everything you do it well. That's probably my tip.
Anna, are you?
Sorry, say that again?
Sorry. Most of what you do at the moment is new build, but you've been involved.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I used to be involved with retrofit, and it was mostly in London, and it was mostly it was a lot of buildings and conservation areas, so hard to retrofit properties. And I think in those cases, you're either looking at the component approach, or you might not even get there because of issues around windows. I think use use PHPP, use the Passivhaus methodology to take it as far as you can go. It becomes harder. It becomes exponentially harder the lower you go. You know, the effort to get from, I don't know, 40 kilowatt hours to 25 kilowatt hours is less than the effort to get from 25 to 15. So I would say use the methodology to take it as far as you can, rather than and as Alan said, obviously do the best you can at all points. But if you don't get to the 25, then and you've done the best they can, then that's great. It's not always just the number that we need to chase.
And Clarissa, you made a decision. Did you get to Enefit with your retrofit?
No, this was a good long time ago before I got more involved in this side of it. The only thing I would have to add is just, you know, what are your reasons for doing this? Is it monetary? Is it just because you've got a passion for the environment, or do you want to have cheaper running costs in the long run? You know, and what's your budget? That will tell you whether, you know, whether new build's going to be better or whether retrofit is going to be something that you can do. It is for you.
It's not an easy subject, and there's no simple answers here. The simple answers are that we do need to retrofit across the country, and it needs to be the sort of investment that we're investing in COVID at the moment across the country in retrofit if we're going to meet our climate targets. Anybody who's retrofitting now and considering deep retrofit is a pioneer, really, largely, and good on you. Okay, Harvey.
Okay, great. Well, so this is a question from Rob. We spoke about plant rooms earlier. Rob is in an existing Victorian house, and he's thinking about retrofitting MVHR, but he's aware it's going to be difficult with solid joists in the property, and he doesn't particularly want to lower the ceilings to lose that height in the ceilings. What has Rob got any other options available to him?
Yes.
Go for it.
I've got a Cotswold stone property, and we didn't change the timbers in them, so it's all traditional. There are very many places that you can hide the pipe. Obviously, we've had to go with the joist, not across them, but we've used different places within the house to get across the house. So we've gone all the way up into the roof space, and of course there you've got any space you want. You can drop down where you need to. At the back of fitted wardrobes, airing cupboards, behind the bath, behind kitchen units. If you've got any stud partitions that are thick enough, you know, the distance for rigid metal is 100 mil, so that can usually fit in if it's a smaller room that doesn't need such an airflow. But where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, we've installed these systems in castles, so, you know, we'll figure it out. That's something for us to worry about it, the design for you, rather than you have to worry about it.
Okay, if there's anybody listening who
have radial
in Castle, then there's a challenge for you. Okay, thank you, Harvey.
Okay, just another quick win question on that topic. And I think it's a spillover from your talk, actually, Clarissa, earlier on. In terms of the ducting for systems in a cooled system, do they require insulation to prevent condensation issues on the outside of the duct pipes?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you always, sorry, Chris.
Carry on, it's all right. I mean, you can all answer.
Generally, you always insulate the intake and the exhaust because you don't really want it to affect the area if it's a warm roof, if it's part of the thermal envelope of the property. When you're cooling as well, then you would also be insulating the supply pipe, so that obviously if it's traveling through a warm area, you've got cold air going through it. Obviously you don't want that to be warmed up if it's going through a warm area. So it really does depend where the ductwork is going for how much insulation is required. And there are different types of insulation depending on whether it's a supply or extract, etc., whether it's traveling through a cold or a warm space. Again, that would be sorted out at design stage.
And I'd just like to add that also important is the length of the primary intake and exhaust ducts. A few jobs that I've been looking at recently, the clients have been purchasing 90% efficient units and then locating them centrally to the houses. So they've got 6.5 metre length runs on the primary intake and exhaust, and that reduces the efficiency of the unit down to 72%. So people really need to, which is on their project, that was a difference of 2 kilowatt hours per metre squared per annum. So that could be the difference between a project passing and failing. So the length of your primary intake and exhaust can really affect the efficiency of your unit.
Okay, let's pick up another question, Harvey.
Okay, great. So, sorry, spare me just 1 second. So, yeah, so this is from Gary, and it's regarding, Gary's looking at building with ICF systems. Yeah, so he wants to use ICF. He wants to benefit from the thermal mass of the concrete within the structure, is my understanding. So, so to get to Passive House certification standard with ICF, does he need to use individual ventilation fans for heat recovery? For example, we've got some on display, I think, in one of the displays that Alan looked at on his tour yesterday, linked with some taping. I think he's concerned, it's a long question, yeah, he's concerned around the space that potentially an MVHR system could take up. He's got limited space, he's looking at different options.
So is this using centralized MVHR or decentralized MVHR, basically?
Yeah, and are there any specific considerations building with ICF building system?
Yeah. I'll come to Alan first, because I can't remember if you said you have worked with ICF, actually.
Yeah, we've got a project at the moment that we're looking at ICF.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's important still to do the PHVP, because shape and stuff will make a big difference. So you might need more insulation if it's a poor form factor. Obviously, the ICF does have some questions in terms of the embodied carbon, which I'm sure Anna will pick up in a minute. So I'd question some of those issues with the ICF. It should be airtight. Yeah, with the ventilation, yes, you do need to ventilate. If you don't put a MVHR in, then you're kind of giving away all the goodness you've done with the insulation. So there are some decentralized MVHR systems starting to appear that are kind of interesting to look at, but you still probably need to make sure that the ducts are there for now. They're not quite as efficient, the ones I've seen so far, but I'm sure there'll be things afoot.
Sorry.
That's it.
And do you promote decentralized units, things like to name a name, the Lunos type systems, Clarissa, at all?
Me? I have to admit that's not my expertise. It's not something I've been trained in. I have seen them, and I happen to be a governor at one of my children's schools, and one of the things that has really been at my heart for quite a long time is the fact that you've got 30 kids sitting in a classroom with no sort of ventilation. You can imagine, how filthy that air is. And I've been thinking, well, would a heat recovery ventilation be suitable in here? But there are so many different age parts of the building that getting ductwork in would be a nightmare. So if you have got a difficult build, then I can actually see that these sort of room heat recovery ventilation type units could be of use. But Passive House, they'd have to be Passive House certified if you wanted to go down the Passive House route. Plus, you wouldn't really have autonomy. There wouldn't be much control over all the house. It would all be very specific, and you would only have one controller that you'd have to go to for each particular room. So it starts to get a little bit inconvenient. Saying that, in a retrofit situation, it could be very useful, especially if you can't get some ducting to a particular part. If you've had an extension done or something in the past, then I can see that would be a good compromise.
I know we did look at this at one of my staff did, and at the Green Building Store, and we weren't convinced that sort of decentralized units, that it didn't come out as expensive generally, unless you're doing specific things like student flats or something like that. Then the sort of decentralized site units seem to end up being as expensive. In some ways, an MVHR system is a very simple thing. It's a box with pipes coming out of it. It's very easy to understand, very easy to maintain. So it's just sort of throwing in a comment from our experience. But
yeah, and of course each one would have their own filters, so you'd have to be really on top of changing the filters to make sure that you've got some clean air coming in.
All those sorts of issues, yes.
We've found the same, Chris.
Yeah, yeah. And the ICF issue, I mean, we did talk about this yesterday as well, didn't we? But I mean, the embodied energy side of it, have you ever looked at this in terms of how much you can reduce that with ICF, Anna?
No.
I'm sorry, I wasn't putting you on the spot. I mean, we did have a little bit, and there are the wood fibre type based ones, and you can reduce.
Yeah, no, I haven't. The honest answer is I haven't. Obviously, you can specify concretes that have lower embodied carbon. They use is it GGBS or, but I haven't really looked at it. I was going to sort of say about the thermal mass thing. I think that sometimes that can be a little bit. I don't know if misleading is the right term, but just there is a point at which thermal mass becomes less useful. It's the sort of the first 50 mil of a product that, or a material, building material that can help dampen out any sort of daily fluctuations. If you put lots and lots of thermal mass in your building, of course, you're actually potentially creating a big thermal store, which might be good at some times a year, might not be so good at other times a year. I mean, the reason that that London is so much warmer than other places is the whole city is a thermal store. So I'd sort of, obviously there's the embodied energy question, embodied carbon question, but also I'd question whether you need to put loads and loads of mass in a domestic building to actually have that damping effect. Other materials can do it, or less can do it as well.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, we've got 5 minutes, and 4 minutes, Harvey, I think. So
yeah, probably it's time for one quick one. So let's have a look. There's a couple of quite specific ones here. Right, I'll give you a difficult one to finish with then. So Derek and Sandra are asking that they're looking at building something in the region of 200 square meters. What ballpark budget should they have for design fees, architectural design fees, and HPP design fees?
Right, so who shall I put on the spot, Alan or Anna?
Oh, it's a difficult one. It does depend on what they want. There's very simple houses and there's very complicated houses, down on the brief. And I think I would say don't skimp on the fees. I think it's very easy to look at these things. Yeah, I would say that, obviously. But don't think that, okay, I'm going to look at architect A and architect B. Architect B is 10% cheaper, therefore I'm going to go for that one. Look at what services you're getting and what time they're spending on that. Because I know we may seem quite expensive to some people, but I know from our bottom line and our finances, we spend a lot of time making sure things are done correctly and well. And it doesn't mean that we're rich from it. So do look at what you're doing. So it can vary, to be honest. So I wouldn't necessarily put a figure on it. I'm honest.
I guess you probably wouldn't add to that, Anna, really.
No, like just to second that, you can't really. It depends on the design. Depends how complicated the project is, not just the square meterage. I mean, and then I'd say not just about not skimping, but also it's about value. So a very good Passivhaus designer will save you money in the construction because they will recommend things that they know will save you operational energy, but also the build cost. They should be able to advise you on that.
I think that's a lesson that
you probably get your money back if you go for someone who has a good level of experience.
And we can take that right across the Passivhaus story, really, can't we? You know, if you build a level of trust with the designer, with your contractor, you know, they may not be the cheapest, but they will deliver what you actually want.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there we are, Harvey. I think probably we're bang on 4 o'clock, I think, aren't we?
Great.
You're not going to allow us to squeeze another one in, are you?
No, sorry. I would love to, but no, we've got to be fairly strict with the time. But just to say a huge thank you to all of you on the panel. and everyone that's been part of the session. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I think we've done another kind of 20 odd again in that hour, so it's quite impressive really. So thank you very much for everyone's input. 3 quick, really shameless plugs from the centre's behalf. So we've got 250 exhibitors here, including these fine people that are represented today. If you want to get more information from any of the exhibitors at the centre, we're offering a virtual lead service at the moment. So just go onto our website and you'll probably see one of the rotating banners at the top will take you straight to that, and you can request information from any of the exhibitors that are on display here at the centre, and they will send you information directly. So that's quite a nice tip to carry on researching your project. Number 2, we've just launched a range of online courses. Our next one starts on Friday, which is on heating your home. And I know we talk about MVHR and other systems on that. £59 for an online course gives you 7 hours of presenter delivered content, really good value. So you can find out about that on our website. And thirdly, our next event will be at some point next month, because I think we're going to change the date because of when we reopen, but it's an eco workshop and it's focusing on project management. So Marie, if you're still interested in project management, come along to that event, and also looking at different building systems. So it's not necessarily Passivhaus, but it will be there will be some passive content within that. I think one of the things we should look at on that day is Enefit, because that has come up a number of times. So if you keep an eye on our website and look out for our e-newsletters, we'll give you all those details. Just a reminder, all these sessions have been recorded, so we will send you the links to all these recordings probably mid-tail end of next week. And yeah, just remains for me to say thank you to Chris for hosting this session and for your session earlier, and to the Passivhaus Trust, and to Alan, Clarissa, Anna and Paul. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for everyone that's joined us. That's the end of our first virtual workshop. As I said, we've had 267 people join us over the last 2 days, so really pleased with that. Enjoy the rest of your weekends, stay safe, and we look forward to welcoming you in person, hopefully in the next month or so at the centre. So until then, yeah, good luck with your projects. Look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you.